Hi everyone. So I wanted to do a video for all my video letter subscribers. Thank you so much. And if you're new on here, welcome. Make sure you check out the archival library of all the unlisted videos in case if you missed any. So today I wanted to talk about these two cards. I want to talk about the Tower card and the Ten of Swords. And the way that I would want to talk about them today is to discuss an ego death, the psychology behind the ego death, what it is and how it happens for each one of these cycles. Because in my experience, it happens differently for the Tower versus differently for the Ten of Swords. And also I will bring in some element of alchemy to help you further see how it all ties together. Sorry for the light. I'm sitting in front of a window and it's very bright today. So these two cards. So let's talk about them, shall we? Put this here. And I have two decks, well, three really, from which I also pulled this card because they really illustrate the point I want to drive today. And I wish I had more tarot decks that have more variety of Tower and the Ten of Swords, but I don't. So this will suffice. Let's talk about ego death for starters. And the way I'll be talking about and explaining the concept of ego death is the concept of ego death that I understand. That is also through my training as a depth psychologist. There's a lot of different people out there that have different understanding and the concept of what ego death is. We often hear people talk about ego death, the death of your ego, in spiritual communities. It's a common term, and it's a term that became especially particularly popular at a particular point of humanity when people really thrived for spiritually to attain and to achieve what they call death of an ego. Somehow the ego, the concept of ego became threatening and became something that people felt needed to die in order for us to evolve, in order for us to be higher human beings. Now, ego, let's break it down a little bit first. Ego is, simply put, your headspace, your mind, your consciousness, what's the thoughts inside of your head that's going on, the way you think, the way you perceive the world, what you think when you look around you. In other words, everything that happens in the software of your headspace is your ego. This is your ego, period. Ego is really, really essential to us as human beings because just think about it. If your ego literally dies, if the headspace doesn't really exist, well, literally you're dead. But not literally is the other form of ego death that can happen where your ego as, the word that I would like to use for that, your ego as a barrier, your ego as perhaps a filter, your ego as perhaps as this this part of you that tends to modulate all the other aspects of your psyche, that tends to modulate also what's permissible to come up from the unconscious, it tends to modulate what needs to be repressed. It's a very important modulator. If this modulator that also has grasp on reality because it's part of the consciousness, and that's how we're able to perceive what is real and what is otherwise deemed not real. If this modulator dies, not literally, but dies in some other forms or shape or forms, because remember, if it dies literally, you're just dead. You don't have consciousness in the sense of existing in this body. But if it dies in other ways, psychologically what happens is this is when people experiencing psychosis. This is when people experience detachment with reality. This is where people are no longer able to discriminate and discern reality from what is not reality. This is where people are experiencing things such as schizophrenia or schizoaffective disorders, paranoid disorders, any kind of other disorders that within realms and parameter of psychotic mentalizing, I would say. So ego is very, very important because it enables us to maintain our grasp on reality. Now, Carl Jung himself actually went through this type of ego death I'm talking to you right now when he was writing and working on his Red Book, or rather what later became his Red Book. The processes that he went through and his relationship with this imaginative figure Philemon from his archetypal realm is pretty much Jung going through this experiencing the death of the ego, and fortunately for him, he was able then to come back and to retain the grasp and hold on his ego self, and come back to reality and come back to integrate it. But for a period of time there, he didn't have a grasp of that. And so for a period of time, he actually went through what somebody could say a psychotic period. I know people might say that it's actually a shamanic period, or some form of shamanic experience. A lot of time people who are shamans tend to go through this type of experiences, and then they evolve because they had this experience of detachment with reality, and so it makes them much more transcendent human beings. But the difference here between people such as Jung and shamans who go through these experiences and people who are actively psychotic in a clinical sense is that Jung and shamans are able to again get a hold of their ego and again come back or put back the modulator into its place, versus people who are actively psychotic sometimes for the rest of their lives are unable to do that. It's just not something that is feasible for them. So that is the main difference. So I want you to understand that this concept of ego death is, when people say ego death, they could mean a lot of other things, and a lot of times we use that word metaphorically, because in reality there's no such thing as ego death. Ego is incredibly essential to us in order for us to exist, in order for us to have an experiential type of sensory experience with this plane of reality. So it's very, very important for us to have our ego. We don't want our ego to die. We don't ever want our ego to die. However, what we actually do want to happen is we want for aspects of ego to die. See the difference? We don't want the whole ego to die, but we want aspects of ego to die. Why? Because we want the aspects of a new potential, of a healthier, more well-rounded, more individuated ego that is now maybe more aware of some elements of unconscious or some other elements, to evolve. This is how ego evolves. This is how as human beings we become more well-rounded, because we go through little deaths, little elements of aspects of ego dying all the time. So it's really healthy. It's good. Think about it as natural process of your psyche, where you shedding the skin like a snake skin, just literal transformation through an aspect of your ego dying, so that a new aspect can come out and be born, and then you go through it again, and you go through it again, and you go through it again. It's a very, very cyclical, and I think in that sense it's very beautiful. Now, a lot of people who are familiar with high magic, not to confuse with the low magic, which is more practical, more result-oriented magic, but with a high ceremonial magic, where it was all about the attainment of your higher self and being able to cross that abyss in order to get into contact and communication with the high guardian angel, which is really is getting to the point where you become aware that that you are one, and God is you and you're God. That's really what it is about. And in the higher magic, they also talk about this ego death that happens when you cross the abyss. And that's very important to experience that ego death in the metaphorical sense, not in a literal sense, because in higher magic, one needs to realize that there's more to you than your consciousness and more to you than your ego. So hopefully that's, for start, illuminated a little bit about ego death. So when people say ego death, ego death, ego death, sometimes we just don't know what the hell they mean. What I mean here is that we do want aspects of the ego to die. We don't want the whole ego to die, but we do want aspects of the ego to die, because that's healthy for us. And in my experience and in my opinion, if there were cards that primarily focused on emphasized aspects of ego dying away in tarot, it would be these two cards. These two cards, in my opinion and my experience, are all about aspects of ego dying if you're using tarot psychologically for self-development, for self-growth. However, I see here two different types of ego death that are happening, two different types of aspects of ego dying. I'm going to use ego death and aspects of ego dying synonymously, because by now you understand that what I mean is we don't want the whole ego to die. We need the ego, it's the operator. So we need that operator. That's who drives the bus. We don't want to crash the bus. So, or car, or whatever mode of transportation. So, how do I see them differently? So let's talk for starters with this, with minor. Okay. So, Ten of Swords. Ten of Swords is a card that I tend to experience a lot of times when the aspect of ego dies on a more material plane. Now, tens are obviously, as a lot of you may know, are lower on the tree of life. It's the most material aspect, it's the most materialistic. It's down there in Malkut. It is also Ten of Swords. It's, again, number 10. It's numerologically, if you're looking at it from the numerological perspective, something is ending, the cycle is ending before it starts again. So there's a lot about tens in of itself that already denote something is ending. Now, the reason why I say that this is an aspect of ego dying in Tarot is because it is an element of air, and it has very much to do with our cognitions and with our thinking process. An interesting thing about Ten of Swords is that this is when an aspect of my ego, I'm going to use that tends to die away in instances when specifically it has to do with attachment to materialistic things, attachment to concrete possessions, to attachment to things that we can otherwise, that really belong and are of this world. So, give you an example. I had Ten of Swords. When did COVID start? Oh my God, this is what happens when the COVID been going on for so long. But right when the COVID started, I've been renting an office for my psychological private practice. So I've been renting an office right when the COVID started. And, guys, for me, I got licensed with a PhD license in 2016. 2016? Yes, 2016, I think, 2016. And the minute I got licensed, I opened my own private practice office. I just went into private practice straight away. And that was, for me, the very first office, my own office, I rented for myself and owned. And it was a huge, huge deal, tremendous deal. It was a big step in my growth because obviously it's more responsibility. You have to make sure you generate revenue to be able to pay for that space and so on and so forth. So it was a big, big deal for me. And I also saved up money to aesthetically decorate it based on my aesthetic. So it just, from beginning to an end, what I'm trying to say is that it was something that was deeply, deeply personal to me. And I was in that office, and my lease was for 3 years. I signed a 3-year lease, and my lease was just about to expire, and COVID hit. And I was just trying to figure out what to do. And in my year had spread, for particular months, I had Ten of Swords. And I didn't think about it until I reflected about it in the end of the year. What I was going on during that month is trying to, because remember when COVID started, nobody knew how long, nobody knew what was going to be the outcome, what's going to happen. There was a lot of flying unknown up in the air. So I was trying to figure out whether I should let go of my office space. And if I do let go, what do I do then? Do I rent? I don't want to rent somebody else's space. I mean, there was a lot of stuff up in the air. And for me, the office was such an attachment. It meant to my ego at the time. So it said so much about me, really. Now I'm rolling my eyes, but back then, imagine for me, it was like, it meant I made it as a psychologist, as a businesswoman, as somebody who's just started out. I mean, it had so much ego grandiosity for me at that moment. Rational and both irrational, but I had such attachment to what that office represented for me. and what it meant for me to be me within the walls of that office. And I let go of that office. My lease expired and I decided not to renew it, and I made a difficult decision to move out of there. My God, that office was beautiful. I miss it, but I also don't, because I outgrew that office by now. Looking back now, and looking back then, I realized what was happening is this. It was the death of this aspect of my ego, this part of my ego that was attached to my persona within my career, and to my persona also within this relationship to what the office represented to me, and I had a hard time letting it go. Fortunately, I did, and I allowed another part of me emerged. A part of me emerged that now showed me that not only can I make it without the office, but I completely cleverly reconfigured my business to keep my overhead super low by being an online business provider. So as you can see, there's always something underneath, and an aspect of ego always needs to die. It's almost a necessity. Of course, I could have kept the office, and I could have been like a stubborn bull. My moon is in Taurus, so I could have been like a stubborn bull, keeping up to that office and sticking to it, and maybe I would have gone into debt as a result. Maybe I would, who knows what would have happened. But I decided to let go of that attachment. So 10 of Swords, a lot of times, is a card in tarot for me, psychologically, when it's an aspect of the ego that needs to die in relationship to materialistic things in our life. An office, need to get rid of the car, need to maybe downsize and move to a smaller home, need to maybe get rid of some things around me. In my experience, it has always been in relationship to material things that ego is attached to, that needs to go in order for something else to emerge. Now this is also a card that to me represents ego death in tarot, undeniably. And yet this is different. I have not experienced this as on this material plane, that something in relationship to attachment needs to let go. This is a different type of ego death. This is an aspect of ego that needs to die, that is more paradigm shift. It's more the way you think, you feel, the way you maybe tend to value things, the way you maybe it's more like a part of yourself. It's more a part of the way you see the world, the way you operate in the world, that needs to die. An aspect of that needs to die. To give you an example, this could be, and it could be actually big, or it could be something very small. In my life, it tends to vary depending how I draw this card. If I draw this card in relationship to like daily draw, it tends to be something small. For example, a shift in my paradigm, a shift in how I see things, a realization suddenly of seeing something differently. So this is a death of an aspect of an ego where it makes you almost, it's as if your headspace is growing and maturing and seeing things differently for the better. This is how I see this. And this is how it's happening. A lot of times, isn't it cute? I just got it. This is notorious. Kasha, if you're watching this by any chance, and you're rolling your eyes probably because you don't like the big eye doll. This is a Tower card. The reason why I pulled this out, this is notorious If anybody interested, let me know. I'll link it below. Anyhow, the reason why I pulled this card is because the Tower here is depicted as Kali. We see Tower being often depicted in a lot of tarot decks as Kali. Reason being is because Kali is exactly doing that. She's asking for an aspect of that ego, to perspective, to mindset, to change, to die away. So it's very, very fitting, right? And this is how I see this. This is more my attachment to things and how things in my life, material things, or material plane of reality, define me, or how I believe they define me, or how I believe they constitute who I am. This is more about paradigm shifts, at least how I experience it. Now, some cards to show you, to give you an example. This is a great example of the Tower card. This is the Witch's Tarot. Because to experience a death of an aspect of your ego where you have a paradigm shift, you literally have to go through this process of fire, which is very fitting with alchemy, I'll be talking about in a bit, in order to burn yourself off. And the process I'll be talking about associated with this is calcination. Latin is not my strong suit. In order to really burn yourself completely, it's an element of fire, the alchemical element of fire, in order to become calcinated for something else to be reborn. This is where she goes through this, and there's going to be a part and aspect of her ego. You know, once you go through fire like this, you never come out the same person on the other end. You just never do. And this is a genius depiction of the Tower. Another depiction of the Tower is this one right here from the Invisible Light Tarot. Butt naked guy looking up at the structures that looks very abandoned. Why is this perfect depiction of what I just talked about? When we go through aspects of ego dying, there's always an element of vulnerability, an element of being stripped away to our essence. He's looking up at this building that is looks like it's abandoned. It looks like it's about to go through demolition process, or whatever the technical term for construction is. I should know this because my husband is architect. But he's looking up at the building, right? There's nothing to do with the building. It's not habitable. You can't inhabit it. All you have to do is to redecorate it, to rebuild it. And this is exactly what it is. It's this complete shift in paradigm where you have no choice but to look at things differently and inhabit things differently now. A great example for Ten of Swords from the same tarot decks is this Ten of Swords. Now, this is a very interesting Ten of Swords because she is actively holding sword, and she is, instead of classic Ten of Swords, person lying down with swords pinning them down to the ground. This is actually, she's actively saying, I'm going to cut away the attachments in this experience, since I link it to attachments, that no longer serve me. And when we get rid of attachments, ideally, if it's on our part, a willful, like my office, right? I had a choice to either list it, or I had a choice to let it go. Still two choices. And I decided to let it go. But even though COVID influenced those choices, the choices were there. And it was an active decision on my part. It was me taking a sword versus COVID being that sword. The COVID maybe is the context of circumstances, but I'm still the one who wielding that sword. So I really like the depiction of Ten of Swords. This is another one from also Invisible Light. And she's lying on the ground, and I don't know if you guys can see this clearly, and the sword, the arrows are all around her, but they're not in her. And what I like about this Ten of Air is that this is an example, in my opinion, what happens, this attachment that we're trying to hold on to, my office, trying to cling to, it will pin us down. It will restrain our mobility. It will restrain our capacity to move around in the world. It will restrain our opportunities, and it will literally restrain our freedom. So this is also a reminder that you have to realize something needs to die, because if you don't let this aspect of ego to die, then you will be, as a result, pinned down. And this is how I see the traditional Ten of Swords. When you're pinned down, is that this attachment will pin you down. Think about how attachment actually literally pin us down in our lives, right? Classic examples. People live beyond their means. They buy the cars they can't afford, they buy mortgage the homes they can't afford, they wear wardrobes they can't afford, and they stack up their debt, and they stack up their debt, and now they're in debt. Now they have to work that much harder to pay down the debt. How this ends up pinning you down. I used this before in one of my videos from the Chuck Palahniuk movie of his book with Brad Pitt and Edward Norton, Fight Club, where Brad Pitt is sitting in a cafe across Edward Norton and he says, things you own end up owning you. Things you own end up owning you. Unless you're willing to liberate yourself by willfully taking that sword. So, quickly alchemy for you guys. This is longer than usual. Sorry. Okay, if you want to imbibe these concepts and run with them in your tarot readings and think about them alchemically. The way I see this is in alchemy. If we were looking at the alchemical processes, would go through the process of calcination. And it is, I have it reading in a book from my college years. This is actually a process of burning materia prima, literally burning those attachments. And psychologically, it means breaking down the ego and attachment to the worldly. Okay? So basically, it's a process where you're heating a substance over the heat, again, fire, until it turns to ashes. And I actually confused it when I was saying that this is calcinato. It is not. This is. So, if you wanted to look at it alchemically, this is beautiful because, again, the process of calcination entails intense heating of a solid in order to drive off water. Think about water as driving off your emotions in how you feel in relationship to these attachments and all other constituents that will volatilize. What remains is a fine, dry powder. Exactly what remained of my office once I let it go. I mean, what is there to remain of it other than nothing but to find powder once I made the decision and it's no longer serves me. This is what happens in this process. Now, I know that some people might think, wait a second, sounds like that's Tower card, the calcinato, the process of going through the fire and literally things dying down. I don't see that quite the same way because I see fire as very active and I see fire as necessary here to willfully will it. Tower sometimes happens to us, the paradigm shift happened to us, not because we are willfully making decisions to let go of attachment, but because things in our life can sometimes affect that paradigm shift. Things can come into our life, we can suffer losses, we can sustain losses, and they can make us look at life and our situation differently, which is a paradigm shift. For the Tower, for this card, the process of alchemy, if you wanted to read up on it and if you wanted to look up on it, is my favorite alchemical process. I will link the name of this book below if anybody's interested. I became obsessed with this book. It is called Anatomy of Psyche, Alchemical Symbolism in Psychotherapy by Edinger. As you can see, I became obsessed with it in my grad school because it was so fascinating to read it. It's just a fascinating book to read. So this is Mortificato. Mortificato is the most blackening Negretto process in alchemy, when things are literally blackened to the point beyond recognition. This is all about embracing dying in order to be reborn. And if you think about it, Tower is often also symbolized as a phoenix flying out of ashes, because you're embracing dying in order to be reborn. In this case, you oftentimes embrace even circumstances that happen to you in order to shift your paradigm. Whereas here, you actfully and willfully wielding that sword. So, just rip the page. My husband's gonna have a heart attack. So, I will link this below. this is how I see Tower and how I see Ten of Swords when they come up for me in a reading. I immediately see aspects of ego need to die, but I see them differently. One is, okay, something about my paradigms, the way I think about things, the way I see things, it needs to shift. And sometimes it's circumstances that make it shift, and sometimes I have to make that actively and shift it. Whereas the Ten of Swords is, okay, which elements of attachments in my life, the materialistic things in my life, or when I say materialistic, a lot of time we think about possessions, but it's also just anything that is on this physical plane. What are some of those things that are really can pin us down? The thing of the world. By the way, food can be an element of that. If we have an unhealthy attachment to the food, to the point where it's starting to pin us down and we need to let it go in order to have that experience of that ego aspect does in relationship to that and to our health, it needs to happen. Hopefully this illuminated something for some of you, or to look at the Tower and the Ten of Swords a little bit differently, a little bit more psychologically, a little bit more nuanced. Let me know, comment below, how you see Tower, how you see Ten of Swords, how do they tend to come up for you in your readings. What do you think about this one? It has to do with more an aspect of your paradigm shifting, and another one has to do with literally just letting go of things. I mean, obviously this one will also shift your paradigm for sure. But let me know. I love to engage and see what all of you think about this. And there was something else that I wanted to add about that. Oh, and do remember that when people say ego needs to die, or death to the ego, I actually think a lot of people, what they mean is that that element of ego needs to die, because really can't kill the ego. We don't want to kill the ego. So anyways, hopefully you all have a great weekend, and I will talk to you later. Bye.